Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 5, The Policy of Orderly Barbarian Settlement and the Fall of Carthage. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, 3 separate groups of barbarians were wandering around the Western Roman Empire: the Goths, the Burgundians, and the Vandals and Alans Suebi coalition. Desperate for troops, the emperor abandoned Britain, hopefully temporarily. The Goths attempted to improve their bargaining position through a marriage between their king and Galla Placidia, the half-sister of the empire, but their son died and the king was killed by hungry followers. Constantius traded a lot of food for Placidia and convinced the Goths to deal with the Vandals and the Alans in Hispania. After a couple of years, the Goths were rewarded with lands in southern Gaul, and Constantius married Placidia. The couple had a son named Valentinian, but Constantius died a year later. The search for a new generalissimo had barely started when Emperor Honorius died. Placidia's son Valentinian was the natural successor, but the generals had little interest in being ruled by a child. So Valentinian's cousin Theodosius, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, sent an army to solve the problem. While Valentinian was the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, his regent, who was also his mother, Galla Placidia, knew that she needed a new generalissimo. The main candidates were Felix, Aetius, and Boniface, the governors of Italy, Gaul, and North Africa, respectively. Aetius had somehow managed to avoid any major repercussions for his support of Castinus, and had even replaced him as governor of Gaul. At first, it appeared that the 3 rivals would keep each other in check, but Felix moved first, ordering the arrest of Boniface, who unsurprisingly ignored the summons to return to Italy. Aetius then accused Felix of treason, defeated his army, and executed him in 430. So, how would the 2 remaining candidates decide who was best suited to serve as generalissimo? Unsurprisingly, they fought a battle, which managed to make the situation less stable. Boniface died of his wounds, but his supporters remained dominant, so Aetius fled Italy for Gaul. It took time, but Aetius had regained dominance by 433, partially because no one had managed to fully replace either Felix or Boniface. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that Galla Placidia simply accepted that someone needed to lead the army, and Aetius was clearly effective. As ever, the Roman generals seemed to fight each other with more determination than they fought the barbarians. One has to wonder if the Goths and the Vandals sat around munching on snacks and sipping adult beverages while marveling at the chaos, and most likely planning how to improve their own situation. So, how did the Vandal and Alan coalition take advantage of the lost decade of instability between the death of Constantius and the promotion of Aetius to generalissimo? Honestly, the lack of imperial control in Hispania was bad, but not dangerous. Well, the situation changed dramatically when the Vandals and the Alans suddenly crossed over to North Africa. Actually, the appearance of the Vandals and the Alans in North Africa was a direct consequence of the gradual restoration of imperial authority in Hispania. Remember, several provinces had been recaptured by the Goths working with Constantius. It would have been natural for the Vandals and the Alans to retake those provinces during the feuding between rival commanders, but the empire had initially remained united following Constantius's death, and the Vandals were pressed even further. However, the Roman army withdrew to Italy after Honorius' death. The Vandals and the Alans were more closely linked now, and they realized that if they expanded north, they might provoke the Goths, so they marched around southern Hispania. The forcible requisitions/pillaging was profitable, but they apparently realized that someone might gain full control in Ravenna and send another army into Hispania, so they should try their luck somewhere else. Fortunately, there was a lot of land just across the Strait of Gibraltar. No, I didn't forget the Suebi, the third member of the coalition. Again, the reason behind the separation is unknown, but the coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi broke apart when the Suebi refused to cross over into North Africa and chose to settle in Hispania. Actually, the change in long-term goals reflected the death of the Vandal king Gunderic in 428, and he was succeeded by Gaiseric, his half-brother, who executed a plan to cross the water and invade North Africa. Aware that the Goths had tried to go to sea and had experienced disaster a couple of decades earlier, Gaiseric moved carefully, building relations with local ship owners. By May 429, Gaiseric was ready and concentrated his army at Taifa near Gibraltar. That army should have been slaughtered when it landed on the North African coastline, but it most likely made the short crossing to Tangier, which could be done in a roughly 24-hour period. So days, or more likely weeks, were spent shuttling troops across. Once everyone had made the crossing, the Vandals and the Alans began moving east along the coast to the towns. Technically, Tangier was part of the province of Hispania, not the province of North Africa, because it was so far away. Roman troops were in the region, but they likely monitored raids by nomads. As a result, the first record of the presence of the Vandals and the Alans is an attack against Hippo Regius in June 430. It was a long walk from Tangier, roughly 2,000 kilometers, and they had probably stopped to pillage and sightsee along the way. Boniface, the governor of North Africa, does not seem to have considered it possible that the Vandals and the Alans could cross in sizable numbers, so he did not keep troops in the area. More important, he was preoccupied with his struggle against Aetius. Anyway, he died in battle in 432. As the Vandals and the Alans came close to the actual province of North Africa, they should have faced a powerful army, but no army appeared. While the Vandals and the Alans may have felt hurt that they were not taken seriously as a threat, the truth is that the Western Roman Empire's army was needed in Gaul, where Aetius was busy trying to manage the barbarian migration into the empire. The management technique consisted of campaigns against the various tribes, who fortunately did not unite. Nearly every year there would be a campaign against the Goths, the Franks, or the Alemanni. Given the situation in Gaul, it should not be a surprise that Aetius could not spare troops for North Africa, so he persuaded the Eastern Empire to send some troops. The Eastern Empire's army stopped the Vandal advance but had to hand over part of Numidia in February 435. While it was a bad sign that the empire had had to surrender part of North Africa, even a relatively small part, Aetius could focus on the orderly settlement of barbarians in Gaul. When the Burgundians were defeated in 437, he used the example of the Goths to convince the Burgundians to accept a similar offer of land for peace. So they settled in the region around Lake Geneva, basically a generation after the arrival of the Goths in Gaul. Meanwhile, the Goths had been expanding, but Aetius was able to force them to return to their original territory by 439. So, most of Gaul and part of Hispania were stable. Great. Unfortunately, North Africa was a different situation. Most of the territory claimed by Gaiseric was not especially fertile, which is probably why the empire had been willing to surrender the land. After 4.5 years of peace, Gaiseric decided to renegotiate the agreement, invading the Roman territory in October 439. Obviously, the invasion should have failed since Carthage had a population of 100,000, so its large garrison could easily defend the city. Not exactly. Remember when I explained that Aetius had managed to first defeat the Burgundians and then force the Goths to return to their original lands? Well, the troops for that army had to come from somewhere, and Gaiseric had signed a peace treaty, so there was no need for a strong garrison in Carthage. Oops. Anyway, Gaiseric was able to fight his way into the city. Moreover, it soon became clear that Gaiseric had used the decade since he had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to raise his sailing game. Once he had captured Carthage, his fleet raided Sicily. While Alaric's sack of Rome in 410 had been a shock, it was a temporary embarrassment that did little permanent damage to the empire. However, Gaisaric's conquest of Carthage was a cataclysmic event. I need to stress that this was not merely a matter of prestige. North Africa produced the grain that fed much of the Western Empire, and many members of the aristocracy had estates there. The fall of North Africa deprived the Western Empire of revenue, shrinking a revenue stream that had already shrunk following the numerous invasions. The empire needed to respond, and respond quickly. A large army made up of men from both halves of the empire was assembled on Sicily in late 440 in preparation for an attack on Carthage in spring when sailing became safe. Spring came and nothing happened. Actually, something did happen. A potentially existential threat to the empire called the Huns. To be precise, the Huns did not threaten the Western Empire, but they had crossed the Danube while the army was assembling in Sicily, so the Eastern Emperor had recalled his men. In short, the empire had faced its true test, and it had failed that test. Each half was now on its own. Recognizing that the western half of the empire could not reconquer North Africa on its own, Roman envoys met with Gaisaric in 442 and made a deal. Gaisaric received formal recognition of his rule over the provinces of North Africa and was given the official title of client king and friend. Most important, his son Huneric was betrothed in marriage to Eudocia, daughter of Emperor Valentinian. Since Valentinian did not have a son, this marriage meant that Gaisaric's son could possibly succeed Valentinian as emperor. To be clear, the son of a barbarian king would possibly become emperor of Rome. Well, the western part. In fact, that is the key point. Gaisaric could be negotiated with. Although the marriage alliance with a barbarian king was undoubtedly viewed as scandalous, it was probably considered worth regular shipments of food from the fertile lands of North Africa. There were other consequences, though. Many senators lost their family estates, and the empire lost a large amount of tax revenue. Obviously, the most immediate consequence was a massive slashing of the defense budget, so the army continued to shrink. Still, there were no usurpers, or at least no serious usurpers, so the army might be able to slowly rebuild since it was no longer fighting itself. If there was no major external threat, soldiers could be recruited from the semi-autonomous ethnic groups living in Gaul. To be honest, the reduced borders were a blessing in disguise. Britain had always been a net loss, costing more to occupy than it generated in tax revenue. I just want to make a quick point about the Vandals. While it is tempting to simply call the new rulers of North Africa Vandals, it is inaccurate. More important, it ignores the genuine challenge faced by Gaisaric. His coalition included Germanic-speaking Vandals, Iranian Alan nomads, and some Goths. Describing it as the Vandal and Alan kingdom is a good reminder, but Gaisaric handled the matter by converting to Christianity, thus giving his diverse followers a shared belief. Remember, Gaisaric had lived his life traveling in search of a home and fighting Romans to gain that home. The journey from Central Europe to North Africa had lasted decades. Since they had won their territory in North Africa, something else was needed to bind them together, and he concluded that Christianity would do the job. However, the Vandals and the Alans did not follow the Nicene Creed that was the official version of Christianity in the empire. Instead, they followed the teachings that had been established during the Council of Constantinople in 360, which had defined the relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and his father as similar, but avoided any specifics of what exactly similar meant. Since the Greek word for similar is homoiosis, the creed was called homoian. Basically, this was a compromise that was open to interpretation, and it was interpreted by a Gothic theologian named Wulfila as Jesus of Nazareth was subordinate to his father. After Theodosius became emperor, he held another council in 381 which condemned the Homoian creed, so all Homoian bishops were forced out of their churches. While Theodosius successfully repressed the Homoian creed in the official church in the Eastern Roman Empire, he probably did not pay much attention to the Goths. That proved to be an error. The Goths had adopted the Homoian Creed and did not care about the Council of 381. In fact, Goth missionaries spread the creed to fellow Germanic speakers and even produced a Gothic translation of the Bible. The decision to translate the Homoian Creed into Germanic ensured that it spread rapidly. In addition, it was not the Orthodox Christianity that placed the emperor at the top of the religious hierarchy. As a result, the new kings naturally distrusted the existing Nicene bishops with their ties to Rome. However, Gaiseric did not launch a persecution of followers of Nicene Christianity because he did not need internal instability. Okay, back to Gaul. So, how successful was Aetius' policy of orderly barbarian settlement? While this process of settlement greatly reduced the amount of destruction, the tribes had a major economic impact on the empire. Regardless of whether the tribes settled in mutually accepted arrangements or conquered regions, the Roman Empire had depended on tax collection based on land ownership. So, coins were minted, collected from landowners through taxes, distributed to the soldiers and the administrators, and then spent in society until they were gathered again for taxes. This impressive administrative organization was not required in regions run by the tribes, since they distributed lands to their followers but did not collect as many taxes. It is unlikely that the new rulers deliberately closed the mints. They undoubtedly liked large piles of shiny silver coins placed in front of them. They just did not maintain the oppressive tax collection system required to maintain all of the mints in operation. They would mint their own silver coins, but the rapid disappearance of copper coins revealed the breakdown of the imperial economic system, since these coins were used in daily transactions. The rapid reduction of coinage and circulation meant that trade became harder and was reduced to barter, which led to a decline in urban populations. So, what has been happening in the Eastern Roman Empire? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it faced an existential threat. The Huns had captured several cities in the Balkans by 442, which transformed the situation in the east, since the Balkans had been peaceful until the last Goth attack in 382, more than 2 generations earlier. Excellent horsemen, the Huns had dominated the region around the Great Plains of Hungary, but they progressed from dangerous nomads to existential threat when they acquired siege technology. Usually, the empire handled particularly dangerous barbarians by moving people and food supplies into fortified cities in order to wait until the current barbarian invader had exhausted the local farms. However, if the Huns had siege technology, then that strategy no longer worked. After a few cities had been turned to rubble, the Eastern Emperor concluded that it would be cheaper to pay them off. Wagon loads of gold ensured an end to the Huns' attacks. A fragile peace held because the current leader, Attila, was busy firming up control after murdering his brother either in 444 or 445. The peace ended in 447, and Attila had swept all the way to Constantinople but could not break through its walls. However, the Romans could not drive him out of the Balkans. To sum up, there were 3 candidates for the position of generalissimo, but Aetius had won the contest by 433 because he was the only one left alive. The fighting between the rivals had left the province of North Africa vulnerable to a surprise invasion by the Vandals and the Alans, who had crossed over from Hispania. North Africa was a big place, so Aetius focused on Gaul, where the Burgundians were convinced to accept an orderly settlement like the Goths. Unfortunately, the Vandals and the Alans captured the critical port of Carthage. Since both halves of the empire depended on the region for food supplies, they planned a joint expedition to retake Carthage. However, the expedition was cancelled because the Eastern Empire became preoccupied with the existential threat of the Huns, led by Attila. The situation in the East was a stalemate, and I will explain what Attila did next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description. Or you can buy me a coffee.